The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
For a premier who is, by all accounts, by every measure, a populist, this was no longer a popular, easy decision. It wasn't just a, yep, Hazel was right.
Then, later on The Agenda.
There was a lot of resistance in the city, like corporate sponsors didn't believe in investing in a basketball team. So it was a lot of challenges, but it was also kind of this like exhilarating experience. People were leaving their jobs to take a chance to join the Raptors.
With the Ontario Legislature set to resume sitting next week, we thought we'd focus on two issues tonight that have bedeviled the current provincial government for quite a long time and discuss whether they finally got a handle on those issues. We're going to talk Greenbelt and Peel Region, two issues which Premier Doug Ford has famously taken firm stands on, then thought better of it and retreated. So let's discuss this with Michael Taube, columnist for several publications, including the National Post, Troy Media, and Loonie Politics. He was a speechwriter in Stephen Harper's PMO. Amanda Galbraith is here, principal at Navigator and a regular contributor on News Talk 1010 Radio. Among other roles, she was head of communications for former Toronto Mayor John Tory. Kim Wright is principal with the cleverly named Wright Strategies. She's a former NDP advisor. And Martin Redcon is here, Queen's Park columnist for the Toronto Star, and we're delighted to welcome the Kansas City Chiefs of provincial panelists here today for a discussion about these things. And in the interest of full disclosure, as I often have to do when we discuss these matters, I just want to put on the record that my brother, Jeff, is a home builder in Southern Ontario, and since we're going to talk about the Greenbelt, we put that out there in the interest of full disclosure. Sheldon, why don't you put this graphic up and we'll just get a little bit of the background to our first subject, which is the Greenbelt here. Building in the Greenbelt or not is something the Ford government has considered. Let's go back to April of 2018, when then candidate Ford was caught on video pledging to open the Greenbelt to development. The following month, he said, the people have spoken and we won't touch the Greenbelt. But then in 2023, Greenbelt development was back on. And then in September of 2023, Ford apologized for breaking his promise. He pledged no more development in the Greenbelt, and of course, in the process, lost 2 cabinet ministers to resignation. So let's start on this. Amanda, to you first. Is this story over?
I don't think it's over because we know there's an ongoing investigation, so that continues. But I think as far as what the public is paying attention to on the Greenbelt ups and downs, I think most people have moved on to affordability and those sorts of issues. So I think the Premier's continued ability, like Teflon-like ability, to take a hit, have it sort of, fade away a little bit, apologize, and pivot, remains unabated this long into his mandate, which is pretty remarkable for a politician.
More on that subject to come. Kim, how about it? Is this story over?
It's not over because fundamentally the biggest challenge is, and I hate to say the Premier was right, but we still have 1.5 million new units of housing to build across the province of Ontario. I would actually argue it's probably closer to 2+ million units, and it's not getting any better. There's a reason, Steve, that we have tent cities in municipalities across this province that may or may not have had a hidden homelessness problem, but now it's front and center and municipalities are having to deal with it. They need to start building housing. They need to start approving housing. And all this back and forth on Greenbelt has done is given more an emboldened NIMBY movement that municipalities aren't living up to. And frankly, the Premier, I would have expected him to be more bold on how do we actually get these things built. And that's going to be a challenge for his caucus going forward.
Michael, is the story over?
Largely. I mean, I always believe Harold Wilson, even though I don't like to naturally quote a Labour Prime Minister, who said, to paraphrase, a week in politics is a long time. So most people, like Amanda said, have moved on. So I do agree with that. The key, though, is messaging, and that is always the key that many of us in this panel have actually learned, been part of, or in many cases, given to others. And we understand that messaging is important. So naturally, even though what you showed on the graphic is a 5-year gap as to the way Doug Ford, then, Premier of Ontario, looked at it then and the way he looked at it in 2023, the key is that it will be brought up from time to time. So while certainly Doug Ford and the Ontario PCs have moved away from this issue and are looking at other matters which are pressing right now, the point is that the opposition, obviously the Liberals, the NDP, the Greens, and others, have to actually continue to focus on it, to be fair. But from a conservative perspective, we've moved on. I mean, it was a mistake. It was badly handled. We'll talk about certain aspects of it. It could have been done a lot better. Not in terms of development of the Greenbelt, which actually I think is actually logical. It was the way it was presented. It was the fact that they didn't look at polls which directly said most Ontarians did not want it. And they proceeded through in such a fashion that the image or the visage that actually was created from it looked awful at the end. And that's the big problem.
Does the fact, Martin, that there are still a couple of outstanding investigations to report back, does that fact ensure that this story is not over?
Well, absolutely. Whenever you say a police investigation, people perk up. Look, I'm not part of the messaging panel. I'm a journalist, and I deal with messaging. But the message 5-6 years ago in 2018 was that the Greenbelt will not be touched ever, ever, ever. And then the message changed back and forth, flip, flop, flip, flip. And I think the challenge is that, one, it'll come back when the police investigation reports. The opposition will raise it again. Absolutely, it has abated for now. I think the bigger challenge beyond messaging is that Doug Ford, you may believe that Doug Ford did this to enrich his cronies, we'll see. But at the other end of this, he really did this because he felt he needed desperately a fix for the housing shortage that Kim talks about. But he wanted a quick fix, quick and dirty. And that's what backfired. And even if it had gone ahead, I don't believe for a moment that getting some of those camera-ready, not camera-ready, but those areas of the Greenbelt that are more serviced would actually deliver the problem. I don't believe that for a moment. It's a much more intrinsic and deep-rooted challenge to give us those 1.5 million units.
What's your sense, Kim, about whether or not the Premier's prime motivation on this was getting homes built or satisfying people who had given money to his party?
Oh, those are very different things, and both things can be true at the same time. I think one of the bigger challenges, and where this becomes a scandal that continues to the gift that keeps on giving for the opposition parties, is you had things like his former principal secretary going off to Vegas for massages, and deals being or may have been done at that point. Those just look shady to people. And that continues to give fodder to Marit Stiles and the New Democrats. And every time that there's a new investigation, this becomes, what is it about the people around the Premier that are, have these conversations, these deals? There is no question that we need housing. What is become questionable is, how do we do it? How do we do it fast? And who's responsible for it? And honestly, many people will see my NIMBY Tears mugs. Everybody that sits there and says, well, I don't want this type of housing or this high of housing, but I really don't like that there's, homeless people living on our street. Those two things have to get solved if we're going to tackle the affordability problem.
Kim's right that two different things can be true at the same time, but it does. Well, I shouldn't say it. I should ask you. Do you think it looks kind of icky when you read in the newspaper, for example, in Martin's paper, that developers stood to gain $8 billion worth of revenues from this, profits from this, and many of them just happen to have given money to the Conservative Party?
You could argue, the optics are not ideal, I think we'd all admit. We don't know if that number is true, by the way. That's what the Auditor General's put out. And with respect, we don't know how she calculated that. So I call into question that number. Second, I think parties donate, a lot of these people donate to all the political parties. They donate to the Liberal government in the past. They'll probably donate to the next Liberal government. I'm sure Bonnie Crombie has a ton of donations on her record, which is fine. So I think part of it is just how the system runs. People donate to political parties. That's a legal thing that they're allowed to do. They also have run businesses where they develop land and they build houses. And if we want housing to get built, people have to make money doing it. So, yeah, we can criticize the optics of it, but either you want to build a house or you want to sit around and talk about it. And candidly, I want to build housing.
Okay, but optics, we all remember a $16 glass of orange juice, right? Optics matter a lot. Are the optics in this case Well, where would you put them on a scale from 1 to 10 for the Conservative
Well, I mean,
government?
certainly Bev Oda remembers the orange juice, but yes, not to attack her. But the optics, look, I mean, optics obviously are everything in politics. They're everything in life in general. It's not great. I don't necessarily go as far as Martin to say that this is an issue where he was awarding cronies. One of my worlds is mortgages and investments, and I can tell you that developers will glad hand anybody that they want to get what they need. And we saw pictures actually not long after the first episode happened, we saw a picture of someone who actually was shaking hands with conservatives, with liberals and others, and he was in development. So it's not unusual to see that. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it looks good. And obviously to the average Ontarian, whether they know a lot about politics, whether they care for Doug Ford and the Ontario PCs, or whether they're a cheerleader, they don't like seeing it. So the optics don't look good, but there are always ways to couch language, to shift things aside and actually move it in a different direction. The key for Doug Ford, and one he's always been very good at, is when he makes a mistake, after a little bit, like everybody, because they obviously have their ego, their guts, and they don't want to say that they were wrong, he apologizes. We've attacked politicians in the past for not apologizing. He apologized. He got to it. Sure, a number of other people were rolled over. Todd Smith, unfortunately, got caught in it. A chief of staff, a staffer.
Not Todd Smith.
Oh, not Todd Smith.
Steve Clark.
Steve Clark, pardon me. Sorry, Todd. But you're right. Steve Clark, someone else, and chief of staff for another individual, they got hit by it. So the proverbial bus caught them. But at the same time, I think once they apologize and move forward and look at other issues, that's to their benefit. Don't focus on it.
MRC.
Well, with the greatest of respect to my colleague Amanda, I have been very critical of the Auditor General over the years. This time, I don't think she was wrong. She did the same math on the $8+ billion calculation that applied to the gas plants. Remember the $1 billion boondoggle? She just looked at the future capture of profits. And it was calculated not by her, but by AMPAC, the property evaluation people that we all love. So the problem was that it was a fire sale, in essence, because there was this enormous capture, this enormous delta that developers were able to reap. That's what drove people crazy, in addition to the cronyism. I think Dalton McGuinty, a former premier, once said that it's never too late to do the right thing. Sometimes it is too late. It was for him, right? Because the gas plants, despite him doing it just in the middle of an election campaign, did come back 1, 2, 3 election campaigns to hurt the Liberals. So we'll see. We can't predict these things in politics, especially in Ontario politics, which is so unreadable. But I do think that that Ford's Tories did take their time apologizing. Bless him for changing his mind ultimately. But Steve Clark, his minister, not Todd Smith, hung in until the bitter end. This is a minister who had called throughout his career in opposition for Liberal cabinet ministers to resign and refused to resign until Labor Day when he finally saw the light. So
we should point that out, Amanda. There's been plenty of collateral damage in this story. Now, the Premier may have saved his government. He may have saved his reputation. All of that is yet to be determined. But Steve Clark really got hurt by this. And Khalid Rashid really got hurt by this, another minister from Mississauga who had to fall on his sword. And 2 political staffers also. Michael's right, got thrown under the bus on this one. How does all that, where in the equation does all of that come in?
I think Steve Clark in particular, we all agree, was a big political loss for the Premier. He was very well liked. He was quite, in spite of, I think, this issue specifically, was viewed as a very competent minister. So, yeah, it's unfortunate whenever you see political staff, candidly, get hurt. It's unfortunate when you lose ministers. I think broadly, the government, in spite of all of this, and I would say most politicians couldn't weather that, right? Losing 2 cabinet ministers, losing a bunch of staff, having a series of police investigations, some of which are ongoing. Like, that's kind of wild to think that we're all saying, yeah, other than the police investigation, people have broadly moved on, but they've managed to do so. So I do think, the other shoe could still drop. That was obviously a very challenging time for the government. We saw that in the polling numbers, but they have managed to move forward because I do believe the desire for Ontarians right now to get housing built in this province is real. And I think if they push that forward, my guess is the government will pivot in the next couple of months to probably trying to push a positive message around that, as they should, right? Because that's their job. Their job is not to look backwards in the mirror and say, like, oh, we screwed up really badly. It's how can we solve the housing crisis Kim talks so eloquently about.
Well, okay, let me give you the last word on this. We all sort of hang out in some similar circles, but we also have our own independent circles that we hang out in. And I don't mind saying here, in some of the circles I hang out in, people aren't talking about this as much as they used to. They just aren't. So in your circles, has the public turned the page on this story?
They largely have, except for they can't buy a house. Their kids are still living in their house. So those kids can't go out.
But Greenbelt as scandal.
So Greenbelt as scandal is until something else comes out. Also say that if we really are interested in creating a conservation area, frankly, the provincial government could have just bought the land and put it into a trust, as opposed to creating this inevitable situation. And, you know, if you go back to the original development of the Greenbelt, some of that land was actually just for political convenience tossed into there. It wasn't this well thought out creation of thought and study. It was a politics decision, rightly or wrongly. Then when you talk about the Auditor General having some number that is created, some of those parcels of land should have been developed. They had been developed right up against it across the street. I'm not saying it's a perfect scenario, but if you really were serious about protecting this Greenbelt, then the province should actually make those folks whole that they bought it from, farmers in particular that they bought it from, that will go out and say, this is no longer developable from a farming community standpoint. Some of those parcels of land just aren't good farmland anymore. So how do we do that? And that is actually the bigger challenge. And I know I ask more of politicians writ large, but maybe we need to start looking at these things from beyond the crass politics, but what is actually good for it. And that becomes the bigger challenge of governing, not just politicking.
I should ask one more question about this, Michael. I'll put it to you, and that is that it
Just don't ask me about Steve Clark.
No, we'll leave him alone for now.
Exactly.
There did seem to be a kind of a back of the envelope. We're just sort of freelancing and figuring this out as we go along.
Yeah.
No particular process, no particular oversight, no particular fairness about the way it all worked out. I mean, is that the way government's supposed to work?
No, I mean, but that's the obvious answer. Unfortunately, lots of things happen behind the scenes. Many of us have seen it. It's not nice, it's not pretty, but it does occur. But no, in theory, it's not supposed to happen that way. The problem is it was basically the way it was presented. It looked like people were doing things behind the scenes even if they weren't. The contracts were not put up to tender. Kim's suggestions were not considered, where you could have made into public land or given some stuff possibly to farmers and others and let it develop that way. There are naturally ways you can create hybrids, you know, where you have obviously a lot of residential stuff, buildings, otherwise, but you have green space. You could have balanced it out. That's why I've never felt that the Greenbelt is something that is hands-off completely. There are ways to do it. The problem is the way it looked here, it looked like they ran in willy-nilly, that they just basically awarded a whole bunch of money to other people, and it all fell apart in the seams. Even if that's not the case, and I don't believe it was, that's the image some people thought about it, and that's the image that some people are going to remember come the next election. But generally speaking, most of us have moved away from it because there are other issues.
Okay, speaking of moving away, let's move away from the Greenbelt and talk divorce. And by that, I just mean the dissolution, not a who, but a what. The dissolution of Peel Region. And Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up this next graphic here. We all remember back in May of 2023, Doug Ford, Premier Doug Ford, pledging to introduce the so-called Hazel-McCallion Act, which would have allowed Mississauga to leave Peel Region, of which it has been a significant constituent part for going on 50 years. But then several months later, in December of 2023, Doug Ford backtracked on the Peel dissolution plan, and Peel stays as is for the moment. Okay, let's go in inverse order this time. Martin, he's made two different decisions here. Which was the right decision?
Oh, that's a trick question. I think the pattern is that they were both flip-flops. I think they were both poorly thought through. So I'm not sure what the absolutely right decision is. I think the politics is what was driving the decisions on this one as with the Greenbelt. If you asked Hazel-McCallion, it was an obvious decision. There was an imbalance for taxpayers, etc. If you asked Bonnie Crombie, the then mayor, now Liberal leader, again, Patrick Brown, mayor of Mississauga.
Mayor of Brampton.
Thank you. Not Steve Clark. Patrick Brown, mayor of
I'm never going to live this down.
and so, if you ask the mayor of Caledon, she supported this back at the beginning and then changed her mind. She's now opposed to it. So sometimes there isn't an obvious decision, and to govern is to choose. I don't pretend to be an expert, so I'm not going to choose, but I'm going to analyze or argue what I think was not the right choice, which was to do this for political reasons and to take the path of least resistance. I guess Doug Ford finally had to acquiesce to Hazel McCallion, deathbed promise to her, went ahead and did it, thought that Bonnie Crombie, or perhaps hoped that Bonnie Crombie would remain as mayor of Mississauga once he gave her this gift. And then when she ran to be Liberal leader and potentially will harvest all those Mississauga seats, now there's no upside for Doug Ford anymore. There's losing those seats anyway, and there's the downside of having Brampton mad as heck at him. And so I think that is where I land on this, is you have three former and present provincial party leaders, right? Patrick Brown, former Conservative leader, Doug Ford, the current, don't like each other much. Doug Ford and Bonnie Crombie don't like each other much. All that triangulation, all that bad blood, and a divorce.
Amanda, take us back. Take us back to the deathbed promise that Doug Ford made to Hazel McCallion that, yes, Hazel, as I sit here holding your hand as you are about to expire, I give you my word, Mississauga will be allowed to leave Peel, and then going back on that word. How bad does that look?
I mean, a deathbed promise is quite something, right? We've all been probably with a loved one as they're passing. You make these commitments, and then politically you choose to reverse it. So I think that is, anyway, to me that would be just personally like a lot to go through. Knowing the premier, I can't imagine it was an easy thing for him to do. Like, we can all talk about the crass politics of it, but I think he genuinely really liked Hazel McCallion. I think they were friends. And I think breaking a deathbed promise to a friend that was like one of the most meaningful things to her in her entire political career was probably not a small thing that he thought through and did. But they did face like a considerable campaign, candidly, mounted by Mayor Patrick Brown about the tax implication, the cost implications for there. So you can make, I think that what we're talking about today is you can make promises or commitments or statements, and then when faced with facts, either publicly or privately, and maybe he knew these facts when he made that promise to her. I don't know that. But they changed their mind, and I don't think that was a small decision for him, would be my guess.
For sure. You say facts. I want to go to you on that next, because there's one study that suggests that if Mississauga were to leave Peel, that the tax implications for the property taxpayers of Peel would go through the roof.
Substantial.
Now, when Bonnie Crombie was the mayor of Mississauga, she had a different study, a competing study, which said, actually, this will all be fine. So if you're a person trying to make a decision about this, I'm giving the premier a little bit of an out here. If you're a person trying to make a decision about this, you got two competing studies, as is often the case in public life. What do?
Well, there's a couple of parts to this, which is fascinating. If you go back to just after the 2018 election, the premier actually started doing all of these divorces, amalgamations, re-amalgamations, reimagining with a number of municipalities. And in fact, some of those got restarted. You know, I look at Niagara, Halton, various communities across the province. So there is somewhere in some drawer somewhere in a locked safe that would rival Al Capone is that 2018, 2019 report on what to do with all of these municipalities. What will it cost? What will it cost politically? Never to be seen from again, this document. So now we're back at it. And what we've seen in Peel is, oh, wait, it's not as clean as you get the water treatment facility, we'll take police, you get social services, we'll take this. It's not like we used to dole out our hockey cards back in the day, the not got it, need it, got it. This is substantial tax dollars. This is substantial renovations. This is a substantial amount of people who will be impacted. And for a premier who is, by all accounts, by every measure, a populist, this was no longer a popular, easy decision. It wasn't just yep, Hazel was right. This is a lot more complicated when you start to look at the personalities in politics. And you then look at places like Brampton, which has been a bellwether from the last couple of campaigns. You know, the Conservatives have it all now. The New Democrats had it before. And when we start looking at the crass politics of who forms a government and how does one form a government, it's a little more complicated than a deathbed promise.
Michael, pick up on that, because that's a key thing here. The Conservatives have all the seats in Mississauga and Brampton, well, except for the one guy who's now dropped out of cabinet and sits as an independent.
Right.
But basically, talk to us about how the politics and hanging on to all of those seats is underlying, I guess, all of what's going on here?
Well, sure. I mean, you basically go to those who brung you to the dance. If you owe certain places, you're obviously going to look at them more fondly. For example, federally, when Toronto never elected Conservatives and we had Conservative governments, or very few at best, we didn't naturally go there and look towards them for ideas and answers. We looked towards, say, parts of the 905, the 519, the 613 that actually gave us members, created our caucus, and then we could build from there. Doesn't mean you completely ignore Toronto, but you do it differently. The same thing happens here. Brampton and Mississauga is primarily PC territory. You have a lot of ethnic communities and minority communities that have come in who are, at least, if nothing else, resonating with the message. They like what they hear. They're content for now. Two straight majority governments, and it doesn't matter what the voter tally was. Everyone keeps using that. It's two majority governments. That's how you have to look at it. So that means you're content with what you currently have. But if things change, then naturally the game changes as well, which means that at some point you may actually have to look at Brampton and Mississauga and decide for yourself, do I have to give up on one? Do I coordinate with another? Do I build them together? Or do I move or look elsewhere? And that's really key to it. So yeah, politics plays an enormous role in this, whether people like it or not. And it's always going to. So that is part of a key of strategy. You have to go where your base is, and if your base is there, then that's where you stand.
But the base is the whole region.
Of
I mean,
course.
That's what's
and the
tricky
base
about
is,
it.
yes, it is the whole region, as of right now. Yes.
Except that Bonnie Crombie has a head start in Mississauga. Let's not forget, though, that we talk a lot about taxes, but potentially one of the big decision points for a populist premier is that it now looks like, or perhaps always looked like, there's going to be job losses in this divorce if it had gone ahead, and the timeline would have been just perhaps ahead of the election, and that's the kind of mess that government really doesn't like. You mentioned Parm Gill, who's dropped out. I wanted to just remind us that there are now 4 cabinet ministers who are gone from the Ford cabinet.
He left to run federally.
He left to run federally. We talked about Steve Clark, Ali Rashid, and of course Monty McNaughton took his leave on his own initiative. So that's 4 ministers down in the midst of all of this tumult, all these zigzags.
Well, okay, we got about 6 minutes left here, and let's get into one last big issue, which is, and you touched on it earlier, so let me come back to you full circle on this. Doug Ford does seem to have an amazing superpower, which is to say he can go out there and step in 3 feet of manure and get it all over him, and then come out before the cameras and really emote, apologize, and his polling numbers go right back up. As they used to say on television in the 50s and 60s, "Splain, Lucy."
I won't hit you over the head with a rolling pin after I do it. It is remarkable, and I think it is actually his superpower, and it is rare because he seems to be able to act as almost a spectator on his government sometimes. It's like, hey, Premier, what do you think about your government wasting? Oh, that sounds awful. I can't believe I'm going to get to the bottom of it. It's like, no, man, you're in charge. Like, how can you possibly? But he has, I think, been able to consistently kind of paint himself as an outsider. I'm not part of this machine. I think the longer he goes in government, I think the less that ability remains. But yeah, he does have a Teflon-like ability to stand back and say, you know what? That was the wrong thing to do. I'm super sorry. Like, aw shucks, folks, let's move along. And he's kept that. I've actually never seen a politician be able to do it as effectively as he has.
Or as many times.
As many times. But I also do think that in politics, and particularly all of us as kind of almost like sports fanatics watching the thrust and parry of this, we really obsess over flip-flopping or changing your mind. I think most people in the country, most voters accept that that's part of life. And if you have facts in front of you that maintain that, then you can. So I think people care less about flip-flops than all of us do, which is also why he's able to do it.
How infuriated are New Democrats at being, once again, watching the Premier do this over and over and over, seemingly successfully?
Oh, look, there's a couple of parts to this. You expect the Premier to do this at some point. You're just like, okay, this is, the usual thing. What I've actually been really quite encouraged by has been watching the New Democrats, in particular Marit Stiles, being out there talking about the closures in Minden and in the emergency room. She just did a Northern Ontario tour, going into the mines, talking to people on the ground, what's happening. She is also promoting really interesting women-led businesses. There's a coverall manufacturer in Northern Ontario that makes it specifically for women. And, again, women in trade, something Minister McNaughton was quite good at talking about, but the rest of this government not so much. So it gives you, if you're an opposition leader and the leader of the opposition, you're going to go out and say, here is what they are doing. They are not going to fulfill any of these promises and these aw shucks. We're not getting the housing built. We're not getting the emergency departments up and operational. You're still waiting months and months and months, no matter how much gobsmacking amounts of money are in the Ministry of Health. You're still not getting your hip replaced nearly as fast as you should be. Those are the things that if you're an opposition leader 2 years out from the next election, you're building up that database. You're finding those candidates. You're finding those issues.
Make sure we get the other guys in before we run out of time here. Tell me, are you concerned, as a conservative supporter, are you concerned that the kind of aw shucks approach Doug Ford takes will ultimately have a shelf life?
No. He's a master at it. I agree with Amanda. Amanda and I come from the same playbook, and it's not ours. This is something completely different. And the real key is, very quickly, it's Ford Nation, the ideology that he basically follows, or the philosophy that he follows. There's no current strand of it. I've written about it. It's quite interesting. It's a mixture of small c conservative values or sensibilities. That's really what it is. He's not a hardcore small c conservative like I am, like Amanda is, like others are, but he's got those sensibilities, so we identify with him. He's a populist. We've talked about this. He uses populism brilliantly. The aw shucks. Listen to me now, folks. All these lines, these actually work extremely well and resonate really well. Sure, doesn't in Tony Toronto, it doesn't necessarily fit. The rest of the problems, it works wonders. And the other key is retail politics. He was a master of it. Doug Ford and his late brother, Rob Ford, the former mayor of Toronto, were masters at this, better than anyone I've ever seen. And we've seen other politicians use variations of it. U.S. President Donald Trump, the former U.S. president, used it to some extent. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson used it to some extent. Former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison used it lightly. The key there, those three are out of politics as of right now, although we'll see what happens with Trump. The only one who's left is Ford, and he's really the king of it. Not that anyone followed it, but basically, in many ways, they built the blueprint for it.
Last minute and a half to you.
Well, it works until it doesn't. I'm going to dissent respectfully, again, from everyone on the panel and say that, yeah, he has worked wonders with the apologias, but and the acknowledgement that he was wrong. But the one constant in all of those years, starting with COVID, when he started the rollbacks, or even before that, is that he had weak opposition leaders, right? So there was no alternative to Doug Ford. That's really what happened in the last election. And we don't know what will happen in the next election. We don't know whether Marit Stiles and the NDP will work wonders or whether Bonnie Crombie and the Liberals will gain traction. They already have, and Marit Stiles and the NDP, despite a new look, have not. And if you look at the polling, Doug Ford went down to 34%, I think, during the Greenbelt mess. He went right back up to 42% in the aftermath in October. Right. He's at 38 now. But the NDP has been flatlining throughout. And the Liberals have been going up and down, leaderless and with a leader, along the way. But what's most interesting in the polling, and this will not come as a surprise to you, Mr. Paikin, is that when you look at the approval ratings for the leaders, they're almost tied, except for a lot of negativity for Doug Ford. But the one constant, all four leaders, all 3.5, including the Green leader, Mike Schreiner, are tied, dead tied on don't know. Can you believe that? So 23% for each of them to 25% say don't know. How can 25% of Ontarians not have an opinion on Doug Ford? That doesn't make sense. The point is, we don't know what's going to happen.
It also points to why campaigns matter so much.
Indeed.
Michael Taube, Kim Wright, Amanda Galbraith, Martin Redcon. Great of all of you to join us here at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was only a few years ago that the Toronto Raptors were crowned NBA champions, but the team's start back in 1995 was far from spectacular. I sat down with sports writer Alex Wong for a little history lesson. But first, all this week, we will be covering conversations from the Rural Ontario Municipal Association's annual conference. Tonight, a quick word about food banks.
So my name is Carolyn Stewart. I'm the CEO at Feed Ontario. Food banks were supposed to be a temporary measure. They were built in the 80s in response to a recession, but unfortunately we still exist. And really that's because over the last 30 to 40 years, we have slowly been chipping away at our social safety net and social systems that were meant to support, that would ultimately make our services unnecessary. So I don't think you could ask a food banker in the province of Ontario who wouldn't love to shut their doors. But how we would do that is through good public policy. So we need to remember that food insecurity is not a food issue, but rather an income issue. And it's about ensuring that everyone has sufficient income to be able to afford their most basic necessities. So that's through things like improvements in access to safe and affordable housing, that's labor supports through improvements to labor laws, and that's even revitalizing Ontario's social support programs like Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Program that are drastically underfunded and keeping people and legislating them into poverty. The biggest misconception about food banks is that I think people have a very antiquated notion what food banks are. I think they have we've done a very almost victims of our own success in that we've, people have that association between the 80s and food drives. Kind of when food banks started, that's what they associate with them, non-perishable canned goods that you give at your grocery store in the bin. But really that's just one aspect of food banks. They do so much more than that. Over 60% of the food that we distribute at Feed Ontario is fresh or frozen. All food banks in our network offer fresh and frozen food to their visitors of their services, but also they offer an additional myriad of services: tax clinics, job fairs, resume building workshops, childcare, dental clinics, health supports, subsidies for utilities, all sorts of other things that are really wraparound supports to help provide support to those who are facing poverty. Food banks are incredibly innovative. I think sometimes people take it for granted. A really wonderful example is during COVID-19, both North York Harvest Food Bank and the Daily Bread Food Bank had a lot of locations that were closed down because they were located in public spaces which were no longer accessible. So they actually partnered with Toronto Public Library to leverage their trucks, who could take a lot of weight, books are very heavy, and leverage that to help deliver food, as well as utilize their spaces to make sure that they could continue to distribute food to those out who are in need during this emergency time. So I think that's just one small micro example of all of the innovation that's happening across the province.
How did a 33-year-old entrepreneur and an unlikely cast of characters sell the idea of basketball to a hockey town like Toronto? That's the focus of sports writer Alex Wong's latest book, Prehistoric: The Audacious and Improbable Origin Story of the Toronto Raptors. Alex, appreciate you joining us at Maddie Ackler to talk about your latest book, Prehistoric. The words that you used to describe the book, sort of audacious and improbable. Why do you use those words?
Because, it's funny, like in 95 when the Raptors started here in Toronto, like I was one of those people that they were selling to. I was here in Toronto growing up. I was an 11-year-old just discovering sports and basketball specifically. And I remember like being at school, being in this hockey town, how basketball was talked about, how it was a secondary sport and how a lot of people just simply didn't know much about it, didn't care much about it. As I was working on this book and really diving into the origin story of how the Raptors started up as an expansion franchise, there were just all these bits and pieces of things coming together, like the season ticket drive, them playing at the Sky Dome to start, and them having to educate fans on how to watch basketball. Like all of it just seemed like, in those words described in the subheading of the book, like it was audacious, it was improbable that this somehow all worked.
Let's talk about the actual roster that gets built on a team. How does an expansion team actually get put together in the NBA?
If you ask the owners at the time, John Bitove Jr. and the rest of the ownership group, they would tell you that the expansion draft process of putting together a first-year roster was very unfair in terms of just competitiveness, because every other team in the NBA was allowed to basically protect 8 players, basically protecting their best players. So all you're left with are guys with either really terrible contracts that they no longer want, or younger players who they had drafted who hadn't panned out. So it's basically you're looking at a list of guys that like nobody else would really want. And that's really how the Raptors team was built to start through the expansion draft, a lot of names that people had honestly like never really heard of.
You talked to a lot of people for this book, 140-ish
Yeah, around
people.
there, yeah.
And we're talking basketball players who are on the roster, coaches, upper management, and even to people who work the day-to-day, marketers, game ops and such. People who are fans now, whether you're a casual fan or you've been following this team, they would never recognize these names. Why was it important to share their stories?
It's one of the things that people always talk about is just the diversity of the fan base and, you know, how it's so inclusive of people of different cultural backgrounds in the city. And when I approached this book about telling the beginning of the franchise, what fascinated me was trying to paint that same lens through the diversity of the people that helped put this team together. You know, I think about the different backgrounds that these people came from, people in the marketing team, people who worked on the dance pack, people who worked on the broadcast team. You know, you talk about the players having different backgrounds as well. Some of them obviously coming from, you know, traditional American backgrounds. There's a lot of European players as well. It was important to me not to just collect these different perspectives to help the readers understand exactly all that it takes to building a basketball franchise in the NBA, but also to spotlight all the people involved, because the Raptors are this growing franchise. They've been here for, you know, almost 3 decades now in the city. I wanted people to know that since the very beginning, it's had a very diverse history and background, even through the people that worked with the team.
You had mentioned John Bittoff. Tell me, why is he important when we look at the Raptors' legacy?
John was, like you mentioned, he was 33. He was super dynamic and he was different. Like, you know, when you think about the traditional sports owner, you know, they might be, you know, a little bit more older. They might be less creative, I would say. John brought a hyper creative energy to the entire Raptors organization. And if you think about the Raptors, you think about their original logo, you think about their name, you think about, you know, the dance pack, you think about all these things that were very 90s and were very dynamic. It was very different. It was not traditional. This was all the genesis of John's ideas. Like, he didn't want to be the Toronto Maple Leafs. He didn't want to be the Toronto Blue Jays. If they were going to start a brand, if they were going to start a franchise, he wanted something that would appeal to what he described as New Canada, which was women, children, and immigrants. And he thought that those demographics were not being appealed to by other sports teams. So everything in this book, everything about the beginning of the Raptors, like, John has his fingerprints all over it.
Did he succeed in that?
To me, I can say definitively that he did succeed. You know, if you talk to Raptors fans today, they now yearn for the purple uniforms. You know, there's a nostalgia about what the Raptors were like back in the day. You know, beyond the fact that I think everybody knows, like, that wasn't a winning product in the very beginning, but there was a lot of excitement. And, you know, he played a huge part into making basketball and the Raptors cool here in the city. And I think it's had this, like, long lasting impact, like, even to present day.
I'm hoping you can help explain, what is the job description for someone who's trying to start an NBA team from scratch?
Yeah, I love that you asked me this question, because this is literally one of the first questions that I asked John when I met him at the office to start this book, because I was trying to figure out exactly all the stories that I needed to tell. So for John, you know, I think when you're the owner and when you're starting a team, the first thing is you have to just hire people and surround yourself with people who can help you. So what he did was he pulled from a lot of different executives who had past NBA experiences from other teams. So people would come in from sales, people would come in from basketball operations. And, you know, when you talk about the job description, when you sit down, the first thing that you have to do is you have to sell tickets. So once he got the team, there was a mandate from the NBA that had to sell 15,000 season tickets in the first year. So he hired a bunch of people basically off the street, kids in their 20s, and they were basically just cold calling people around the city for corporate sponsorships. They were calling individuals. The salespeople that I talked to talked a lot about how there was a lot of resistance in the city, like corporate sponsors didn't believe in investing in a basketball team. So it was a lot of challenges, but it was also kind of this, like, exhilarating experience. People were leaving their jobs to take a chance to join the Raptors, and some of them ended up doing that. And many of those people, those salespeople who were in their early 20s, some of them are now execs on, like, sports teams.
Part of this job was to get people excited, but also explain to them how basketball is played. And one of the responsibilities sort of lied on the broadcasters in a way.
Yeah, so, you know, in talking to Leo Routins, who's obviously still involved with the Raptors broadcasts today, when he was doing color commentary in that first year, like he would have a segment called Rounds, on Round Ball. And what he would explain was very basic things. And when I mean basic things, it was like explaining what a travel is, explaining what a legal defense is, explaining what a technical foul is, or even explaining the fact like, certain positions in basketball, point guard is called a 1, a center is a 5. So they were very conscious that there was a new audience that was tuning in that might not understand basketball.
You talked about a new audience, and part of that new audience and the strategy behind it is a logo. Tell us a little bit about the changes that they had to make to sort of make it marketable to the audience that they wanted.
John Bitov was very adamant about not wanting blue to begin with, because he said he wanted the brand to be global. He thought blue, with the associations with the Maple Leafs, with the Blue Jays, would kind of limit him to being just a brand that people associated with Toronto. He also didn't want red to begin with, because he didn't want to really lean into kind of the Canadiana theme. So originally the Raptor, the retro Raptor that ended up being red, was lime green. That was actually the one that was submitted to the league. And Commissioner David Stern actually stepped in. I think the conversation basically went, the Raptor logo was already a little bit out there. If you compare it to traditional basketball logos like the New York Knicks, the LA Lakers, the Boston Celtics. And David Stern basically stepped in and told John that, hey, we need something that does market to Canada. You are one of 2 Canadian franchises at the time with the Grizzlies. So John reluctantly agreed to change the Raptor to red. But if the NBA hadn't stepped in, it would have been a lime green Raptor. And I actually don't know how that would have turned out.
And it would have been one that would have looked less or more ferocious, because they also made some changes to make it a little bit more kid-friendly as well.
Yeah, so when they were designing the mascot, which was basically based on the logo, what happened was the first designs of the mascot, his face, I think there was the teeth and all that stuff, his facial expression looked really intimidating. And when they put it on and when they test marketed it, I think they realized that this would actually scare the kids that were coming to the Sky Dome. So John actually took a knife and he just basically carved out what he wanted the mascot to look like. And that's still what the mascot looks like today.
How did the organization make basketball appealing to a hockey city? What was the work that was being done sort of on the community level?
Yeah, they had an entire community relations team, and what they did was they reached out. Al Quantz, who's has a long history with basketball here in Toronto and in Canada, led the movement. They reached out to ambassadors in different communities. So they would find people who were running basketball programs at community centers already in the Chinese community, the Black community, the Filipino community, and they would go out, find these people, and what they created was something called a Bell Raptor Ball program, which was a program designed for kids to show up to the gym, and they would teach them skills and hopefully eventually get them into playing recreational basketball or at a more competitive level. So this whole program was distributed out to different people, and I reached out to Clement Chu, who ran a nonprofit organization at the time called CCYA, which was focused on Chinese Canadian youths. And he had actually connected with Al Quantz and the Raptors in '95, started this program. And it's wild to me because I know CCYA because my nephews, who are 11 and 9, go to those programs today. You asked me previously about the connections between the past and the present and things like that. The groundwork that the Raptors laid in terms of the community work, that is also another kind of through line that still continues today.
Great stories about players like Damon Stoudemire, great story of Tracy Murray, and of course the late coach Brendan Malone, that really painted the picture of the struggles of an expansion team. Is there a story that sticks out to you that you told that you can share?
This team won I think 21 games in the first season. When I was reaching out to people in the organization, a lot of them were really excited to talk to me. But a lot of them also asked me oh, why are you actually writing a book on this team? We didn't do anything on the court. So to me, a lot of the funny stories is just the team, the players especially, getting used to the city of Toronto. And one of my favorite stories was John Sally was a veteran. He had been on the Bad Boy Pistons, very established player. But like I mentioned, one of the players taking an expansion draft where he was towards the end of his career. When he came here, one of the first things that he did was he called the PR team and he told them that he wanted to take every opportunity in the city to like market himself. He wanted to start a nightclub called Sally's Alley. Like he wanted to start his own underwear brand. He was a big kind of club promoter too. So like one of my favorite stories was like he actually had a New Year's party that he hosted, invited a bunch of A-list celebrities that showed up. I believe Samuel L. Jackson was there, R&B singer Faith Evans was there, all the players were there. And it was by, the docks, like on, downtown. And what happened was things got so out of control because, it went over capacity. There was an issue with code check. People obviously had a lot to drink that at the end of the night, someone actually drove their car onto the like frozen lake and it ended up on the front page of the Toronto Sun. And Isaiah Thomas, who was the general manager at the time, like we mentioned, the Raptors were trying to build this reputation in the community, et cetera, et cetera. He was so upset by that, and John Sally wasn't really playing that much, that incident pretty much led to him getting waived like 2 weeks later. And then Jimmy King, who was the second round pick of the team, this was his first time coming to Canada. Like he talked about living in Etobicoke and how he would travel around the city, go down Yonge Street, discover his favorite Chinese restaurants. He went to watch Phantom of the Opera, and Oliver Miller talked about how one time, there was such a huge snowstorm outside and he had to go to practice, but when he opened his garage, he couldn't get out of his driveway. So it took him 2 hours to shovel and get to practice, and he was late. And Brendan Malone was like, he was really hard on the guys at the time. It was all about discipline and stuff. He actually held up practice and waited for Oliver Miller to arrive before they started practice. So there's all these funny stories about them just dealing with kind of the nuances of Toronto and being in Canada for the first time.
Of course, there's no snow on the east coast of the U.S., right? Of course. So
yeah, this is always the thing is that, and a lot of the players too, when I talked to them, like when they were taking the expansion draft, people were describing Toronto in those ways. Like a lot of, Ed Pickney, who was another veteran that was picked, I remember his friends being like, hey, it snows there every day. Like they've never heard of basketball, all this stuff. And, the funny thing is I wanted to spotlight those stereotypes because a lot of these players, if you read the book, you'll realize they end up falling in love with the city. And I think that still holds true today.
In most cases, they're the biggest champions of this city. They're like, this is the best city to live in. Which brings me to this question, actually. Did Damon Stoudemire start this narrative or stereotype that star NBA players don't want to play in Toronto? Because, of course, his exit was one that, a lot of people were quite surprised at. It was very public and one that you felt that you grew up with this guy and he's got a big smile on his face and he wants to go back home.
I think just over time, people have started to conflate the fact that there's, unhappy superstars in the NBA with the fact that if they're in Toronto, it adds another element because they don't want to be in Toronto, they don't want to be in Canada. Like I think for anyone that follows sports and especially basketball, that player movement is a very huge thing. It was back then, it is still today. Players get traded all the time. They move in free agency, especially superstars, try to dictate where they want to go. I think about Damon Stoudemire, think about Vince Carter, moving on as well. Think about even Kawhi Leonard, like winning a championship and deciding to go home to LA as well. I don't think it's really a Toronto thing, to be honest. I think this is just how the NBA works. Damon at the time was not happy because the team wasn't doing well. And I don't think that would have been any different if he was playing in New York, in Boston. But it's just that when an athlete from Toronto or when an athlete on the Raptors is unhappy and requests those things, I think suddenly there's kind of an insecurity with the fan base of saying that, hey, like we're not good enough. But usually, most of the times, it's just about whether you're good enough on the court. That's when most guys want to leave.
The Toronto Raptors, as you mentioned, is Canada's sole NBA team. What is the likelihood another team joins us north of the border?
Yeah, I think, Adam Silver, NBA commissioner, recently talked about how, they would be interested to looking at maybe Montreal, maybe Vancouver as viable cities without obviously committing to the fact that they are looking specifically at those places. To me, if I were to be realistic, like I feel like this is something that's not going to happen in the near future. I think around NBA circles, there's an assumption that when the expansion cycle comes around again, the next two teams are going to be in Seattle and Las Vegas. And just unfortunately, you look at the demise of the Vancouver Grizzlies, I think it'd be a huge risk. It'd be a huge risk for the NBA to take another chance. Now, do I think, you know, an NBA franchise could thrive today in a Montreal, in a Vancouver? I think definitely. I think basketball has continued to grow here in this country if you compare it to when the Raptors came in '95. But if you ask me realistically, I think there's just a lot more different locations in the U.S. that is less risky and more viable for the NBA in the near term.
All right, so my last question to you, I'll admit, when I got to this part of the book, it was near the end, my heart melted a bit because you take us through this whole story of, you know, call them misfits, call them, you know, an unlikely group of people to come together. And these folks still to this day, and we're talking players to the coaches to the staff members, still keep in touch. They still see each other regularly. Obviously, COVID interrupted some of that. But tell me about that, because I honestly was like, we're talking about 25 plus years, and it's just like, this is the sweetest thing.
Yeah, I you know, when I set out to work on this book and, you know, talk to all these different individuals, like you mentioned, I didn't know that. But as I started to talking to everybody, you know, they would start mentioning that, hey, like I still keep in touch with this person, I still keep in touch with this person. So they recently had their 25th anniversary reunion. And what happened was, like you mentioned, because of COVID, they weren't able to have an in-person celebration. So what happened was a series of Zooms were set up. And John Bitove was on a Zoom with Isaiah Thomas. And then Samuel L. Jackson, who was a celebrity fan in the first season, popped up on the Zoom. I was able to see just the camaraderie and just the connection that these guys have, all because they all work together to like start this franchise. And this summer, you know, they were actually able to organize an in-person reunion finally at Real Sports. And I was able to be there. John Bitove was there, Isaiah Thomas was there, members of the broadcast team, the dance pack, game ops, and they got together and they were just, you know, I was there just kind of fly on the wall watching them just kind of reminisce about everything. So I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of this book. You know, I think there's a lot of funny and quirky stories in there. And I think people reading this book will get that kind of vibe of like they were part of a startup trying to figure this out on the fly. But it's also the relationships that were built and the connections that were made. And those are still present today.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
The college system especially, I think, has fallen further and further behind, and I think we're the only constituency in Canada that between government grant and tuition gets less than $10,000 a year per student. That doesn't even cover the cost for domestic students.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.